Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling one of history's most terrifying and, honestly, most disturbing questions.
I mean, really think about this for a second. This is the whole puzzle right here. We're talking about a man who was rejected from art school, not once, but twice. A guy who literally slept in homeless shelters and scraped by selling little postcards he painted. So how on earth does that person go on to seize total control of one of the most powerful, most educated nations on the planet? And this is the transformation we have to wrap our heads around. On the one hand, you have 1913, a complete nobody, a penniless drifter in Vienna. And then boom, less than 3 decades later, he's the Führer, the absolute leader, commanding armies that stretch all the way from the coast of France to the very gates of Moscow. That journey from total obscurity to absolute power, that's what we're going to unpack.
So to really get it, you have to start back in Vienna. He showed up there with these big dreams of being a famous artist, but the Academy of Fine Arts rejected him flat out. He was completely directionless, totally alone. It was the outbreak of World War I that finally gave him something to latch on to, a purpose, a uniform, and this burning sense of national grievance that would pretty much fuel the entire rest of his life.
But here's the thing. Hitler's personal anger and his weird ideas wouldn't have mattered one bit if they hadn't landed in just the right environment. He came out of the war into a Germany that was just completely shattered. They were defeated, humiliated, and the whole country was spiraling into economic and political chaos. It was, for him, the perfect storm.
Germany's new government, the Weimar Republic, was just battered by one crisis after another. It was relentless. First, the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Then came hyperinflation. And it was so bad that a wheelbarrow full of cash couldn't even buy you a loaf of bread. And just when it seemed like things might be getting stable, the Great Depression hits the world, and millions of Germans are thrown out of work and into total desperation. At the heart of all this anger was this one single number, 6.6 billion pounds in war reparations. It was just an impossible amount of money. And it wasn't just about repaying damages. It was designed to completely cripple the German economy for a generation, to make sure it could never be a threat again. And the humiliation went way beyond just money. The treaty literally dismembered the nation. It stripped away vital industrial lands, took all its colonies, and basically reduced its proud military to a tiny self-defense force. All this created this deep, powerful hunger for revenge, a feeling that extremists like Hitler became absolute masters at exploiting. Now, this is a really crucial point to understand. Hitler didn't take power in some big, violent revolution, at least not at first. No, he was way more clever than that. He cynically and methodically used the very tools of democracy, elections, public speeches, parliamentary rules, to tear it all down from the inside. His path to power was this twisted, but honestly pretty clear strategy. He was a genius at propaganda, and he could turn even his biggest failures, like the disastrous 1923 beer hall putsch, into huge wins. His trial for treason, he used it as a national stage to get famous. His comfy prison sentence gave him the time to write his hateful book Mein Kampf, which laid out his entire genocidal worldview for everyone to see. This chart tells the whole story in stark numbers. Look at this. In 1928, before the Great Depression really hit, the Nazis were just a tiny fringe party, getting less than 3% of the vote. But just 4 years later, with the economy in total ruins, they suddenly become the biggest political party in Germany. All those simple promises of work, bread, and making Germany proud again, well, they started to sound pretty good to a desperate population. Once he was appointed chancellor in 1933, he moved with lightning speed. A mysterious fire breaks out at the Reichstag, the parliament building, and boom, he has his perfect excuse. He blames the communists, convinces the old president to sign an emergency decree that suspends all civil rights, and then he forces through something called the Enabling Act. And that act gave him full, total, dictatorial power. In just a few weeks, German democracy was completely dead. Okay, so with total control locked down at home, Hitler immediately turned his attention to the rest of the world. He started this series of incredibly bold, incredibly risky foreign policy moves, and for a while, every single gamble paid off, which made him wildly popular and created this myth that he was some kind of infallible genius. He just started dismantling the Treaty of Versailles, piece by piece. He marched troops back into the Rhineland. He annexed his home country of Austria. He took over huge parts of Czechoslovakia. And each time he did it, he was gambling that the Allies, who were still haunted by World War I, would do absolutely nothing. And you know what? Each and every time, he won that bet. But the invasion of Poland, that was the one gamble that finally spectacularly failed. Hitler was absolutely certain, completely convinced, that Britain and France would just back down one more time. But they didn't. This time, they honored their treaty to defend Poland, and the world plunged straight into the Second World War. And that same overconfidence, the same arrogance that he rode all the way to power, was about to lead him into a series of catastrophic military blunders. His belief that he was an infallible genius became his single greatest weakness, and it pretty much guaranteed his ultimate downfall. First up, Britain. He really thought he could just bomb them from the air until they gave up. But he totally underestimated the British people's resolve and the incredible skill of the Royal Air Force. In the skies over England that summer, the German Luftwaffe was bled dry, and its whole myth of invincibility was shattered. The level of denial from his top command was just staggering. Even after this huge strategic failure that made an invasion of Britain impossible, his number 2 guy, Hermann Goering, actually said in public that it was a draw. This absolute refusal to face reality, it started at the very top and infected the entire regime. Then came his most fatal error. Believing Britain was basically dealt with, he turned his massive armies east and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in all of human history. This wasn't just a war for land, it was a war of racial annihilation. He was convinced the Soviet Union would just collapse in a single summer, totally underestimating the vast distances, the brutal Russian winter, and the sheer will of its people to fight back. And this quote, wow, it just reveals everything about his fatal arrogance. He didn't see the Soviet Union as a real opponent. He saw it as a rotten edifice, some crumbling building run by what he called Jewish Bolshevism and populated by people he considered subhuman. He truly believed all you had to do was kick in the door and the whole thing would collapse. He was catastrophically wrong. His last great miscalculation was completely 100% unforced. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler wasn't required by any treaty to declare war on the United States, but he did it anyway, just like that. In a moment of what I guess you could call ideological excitement, he voluntarily brought the world's biggest industrial powerhouse into the war against him. It was a self-inflicted wound that would absolutely seal his fate. So by 1945, with Allied armies closing in from the west and the massive Red Army storming Berlin from the east, this so-called thousand-year Reich, it all collapsed into this nihilistic, apocalyptic fantasy, all of it orchestrated from inside a concrete bunker deep underneath the rubble of Berlin. He fully embraced this mindset, this idea of Götterdämmerung, which means twilight of the gods. He was convinced that the German people had failed him, that they had proven unworthy of his genius. So he issued something called the Nero Decree, ordering the complete destruction of Germany's own infrastructure. If his Reich was going down, he believed Germany deserved to be destroyed right along with it. The final legacy of his 12 years in power was nothing but death and destruction on a scale the world had never, ever seen. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, over 50 million people dead in the war he started, and an entire continent left in ashes. And all of this leaves us with one final, chilling question. Hitler's rise wasn't some kind of black magic. It was a perfect storm, a charismatic demagogue, a nation in a deep crisis, widespread economic desperation, and the slow, deliberate dismantling of democratic norms. And it stands as a permanent warning from history, reminding all of us that the conditions that allow for this kind of catastrophe, well, they're never as far away as we might like to think.